Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining for this video. Cecilia here, and today I'm going to share with you some tips about painting an eye. Of course, there are endless ways to paint an eye, and it really depends on the lighting, the different eye colors and skin tones. So my intention is to give you some practical tips that help you to enhance your painting and make it more realistic. For that, I'm going to paint two different eyes, a do and a don't one, which should clarify the differences that I noticed along the way and the steps that you can apply. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm going to start with the don'ts. What I sometimes see people tend to do is that they paint just one harsh line for the eyelid rather than multiple. Like, it varies, but eyes really have on the left or right side multiple little wrinkles that come together in a certain point and appear as one line. But it isn't really a line, it's a shadow area. And even though people put different values for the skin tone, it still looks kinda unnatural because the line is too sharp. And whenever we paint realistically, we don't want to have harsh transitions. That's just not the way it looks, especially in the face. You can look at it as a clump of clay that you're molding, and there aren't really sharp edges at all. And the same applies to the lower line. I see that some people paint it, but it's just one line instead of a shadow area, and in this way it's not very well blended. When it comes down to paint even more details, there are lots of little smooth wrinkles in the shadow area, so that gets sometimes overlooked as well. In addition, sometimes people forget to paint the waterline, which is a really important part and makes such a difference in painting a realistic looking eye. And the eyes have oftentimes two pointed corners, especially the right one, and the shape of the tear dot, like the outer lines, aren't really individually developed. Speaking of the tear dot, when you look at it closer, it has its really unique appearance, and oftentimes people paint just one line with a gradual shading coming from the outer lines. But some of them are really different, like they have kind of two parts, like a wrinkle in it, or some veins that are slightly visible, and generally glossy spots as well. I think it's important to look closely and really observe how it's shaped, instead of assuming that it's always looking just the way you think it looks, right? Yeah, the best way to study it is by using a reference photo, and I strongly recommend that. When you want to paint realistically, you gotta study and observe the objects either live or with a reference photo. Another common mistake that people tend to do is they paint the iris as a circle in a way that the whole iris is shown. But this is only applicable for certain facial expressions like shock or wonder. Otherwise, the top is covered by the upper eyelid. Furthermore, people mostly paint lines within the iris in different values and colors, which looks great and kinda realistic, but it isn't fully elaborated. Like, the transition of the lines aren't that smooth, and there are different shapes within the iris, not just lines, but also some sort of triangles or dots, like not just straight lines, but more organic looking ones, like roots, for example. And also sometimes there are rings visible, like the ones of a tree trunk. Additionally, most people tend to paint the circle line of the iris way too dark and the line too sharp. But even though this line is darker, it's very well blended with the rest of the colors of the iris, as well as with the sclera. There's a really subtle transition between the iris and the white sclera. The next detail I want to mention is that oftentimes I see that people paint highlights as some sort of a deformed triangle or square, and just one. But actually, depending on the light source, there can be more than one highlight spot within the eye. Additionally, they paint just with a bright white, but it isn't just white. In the highlights there are different color shades because actually it's a reflection of a light source, for example a window. So when you take a close look at the eye, you can see the window in there or the shutter. And in the highlight itself are reflections visible, especially the lashes. Coming to the sclera, a common way to paint it is to just fill it out with white. But the sclera isn't just white at all. Of course, compared to the other color tones of the eye and skin, it is white. But white isn't just white. There are different tones, warmer and colder ones, for example reddish, bluish and greenish tones. It really depends on the lighting and the different types of eyes. And also there are veins in it with different saturations. Painting realism really comes down to noticing all the subtle differences of values, colors, shapes and shadings. So it really is an endless process to learn from because there are so many different possibilities. Another mistake that I sometimes see is that people paint the lashes straight upwards, all going in the same direction. They are too regular as well as too dark and have the same color, length and thickness. And as long as there's no makeup, the lashes vary in the color tone. Like the beginning of the lashes is darker and at the end they become brighter as well as thinner. And not all of them have the same length and direction. What I also notice is that some people tend to make the upper lash line thicker and darker, which looks like just one straight dark line around the upper half of the eye. But this line is a result of the curved lashes, and even though it looks like a line, it's more a fragmented, irregular toned one. Let's move on with the do's. After putting down the values of the skin tone, you can see that I paint a little line. I blend it a bit with the rest and add wrinkles on the left side. For the lower eye line, I said first lay a shadow area and will elaborate that afterwards. I looked at the corners of the eye are more rounded and I pay attention to the tear dot, to its own unique individual shape. Here there's kind of a wrinkle in it, that's why I use in the middle a darker color tone. And also I add a waterline which is a little bit brighter than the skin tone around the eye. But the waterline itself also has values. So the right side is slightly darker than the left side and the inner part is brighter than the outer one. And I don't paint a harsh line, I try to blend it well with the rest. Coming to the iris, I paint the area right around the pupils darker because when you zoom into the eye, you can see that there are sometimes some darker, really thin and subtle lines from the iris around the pupil. It looks like just one dark line from afar, but it's really about noticing all these subtleties. Even if they are barely visible, when it comes down to painting the eye, it helps to be aware of those kinds of details. And also there can be highlights in or right around the pupil. So again, it's important to pay close attention to your reference and look how that individual pupil looks like, rather than assuming pupils always look the way they do. It's about noticing the differences. Then I have a look at all these different colors that the iris contains. This orangey brown fades into a yellowish one and then into an olive green color, and at the end there is a darker green with a bluish touch. So I paint that gradient and you can see I paint lines too, but also some sort of triangle shapes and blend them well. Then I paint the outer circle of this iris darker. The top of the iris is covered by the upper eyelid and the lower half touches the borders of the waterline. In this way the iris doesn't look that big. And the upper part is darker because of the shadow coming from the lashes and the eyelid. So I use my darkest iris color and add even more black to it and blend it nicely with the rest. And this particular iris has some rings in it, so I paint these with a darker color and then white right next to it. But I will work out the details even more. I pick white and paint all these subtle organic lines that reach the end of the iris and in this way brighten up the edge. I preserved a white spot for the highlight in order to keep it as bright as possible. I think it's really easier this way instead of putting a thick paint layer of white on top. But the highlight isn't just white at all. As I said, it's a reflection of a light source. And when you look even closer, you can sometimes see objects in it. So depending on the light source, there are different colors in it. Here the upper part is a little bit darker, that's why I use a greenish grayish tone and blend it with white. And also, oftentimes the lashes are mirrored in the highlight spot, so I use raw umber and paint the reflection. Let's have a look at the sclera. First of all, I blend the edge of the iris with white in order to soften the transition. Because, as I previously said, we want to avoid harsh transitions and sharp lines whenever possible. Then I really study the reference photo for the different color tones that I can see in the white. In this way I can define the shades and values and make the sclera look much more spherical. Overall, the right side of the eye is darker than the left side, and it's kind of a warmer shadow color with brown and red in it. So I play with the tone until it looks what I need it to and apply it onto the paper. The darkest parts are the edges at the very right side. I paint that first and then I fade it with more white the closer I get to the iris. The left side is brighter, but basically I use the same color tone. I add a little bit more red and white to it and fill it out. After that I paint the veins. They're so thin, that's why I need a really tiny brush and flatten it as much as possible. The veins vary in their intensity. There's a dominant one on the right side, that's why I paint it first. It's not just a line, the shape is really irregular and sort of unexpected. Then I paint all the subtle, barely visible veins all around this one and on the left side as well. It doesn't have to look exactly the way it does on the reference photo. It's more important to get the shape and color tone right to integrate it well into the bigger picture. Next, it's time to paint the lashes. Instead of drawing straight lines upwards, I paint them curved. Especially the beginning is curved and then I flatten it a bit at the end. They all have a particular direction, the ones on the outer eye facing in the right direction and the ones in the inner eye in the left. And they kind of meet each other in the middle. Also, they're not perfect. It's good to have them overlapping each other and paint some of them shorter and others longer. And underneath the lashes is a subtle darker line, but not just a straight line, it is well blended with the skin tone of the eyelid. The lower eyelashes aren't coming straight from the top of the line, like where the eyeball ends. There's a section of skin in between. They're coming from the waterline and they're curved as well. Basically, I paint them the same way I painted the upper lashes because they behave similarly, but they are shorter. Afterwards, I brighten all the tips of the upper and lower lashes. The final step is about refining all the shapes and values. I paint even more details in the tear dot, more reflections in the eye, and put the highlights on the skin. The area between the eye and nose is really illuminated, so the structure of the skin is emphasized. I elaborate more details by painting more wrinkles and these little glossy spots. And oftentimes the area right underneath the tear dot and lashes in the inner eye is pretty shiny. Yeah, that's it for today. I hope this video was helpful to you and gave you new insights on how to paint an eye. Let me know in the comments below if you still have questions and also if you like those kinds of videos. If so, I can do more of that, for example, do's and don'ts for painting lips or flowers or other topics. I love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video, for being here and supporting this channel. I wish you a wonderful day and I will see you in my next video.